The rain did not stop when they reached the safety of the small apartment. It pounded against the thin glass of the kitchen window, a constant reminder of the darkness they had just escaped. Mi-kyung stood in the middle of her cramped living room, her hands shaking so hard she had to grip the back of a wooden chair. Her heart felt like a trapped bird fluttering against her ribs. On her small, faded sofa sat the most dangerous man she had ever seen. Jang Tae-Sung was a mountain of a man, but right now, he looked like a fallen monument. His expensive white shirt was ruined, soaked through with rainwater and a deep, frightening red. He leaned back, his face pale as salt, his eyes half closed. Next to him, tucked under his large, heavy arm, was Ha-Eun. Her daughter's pink jacket was muddy, and her small face was streaked with tears, but she wasn't crying anymore. She was holding onto the man's sleeve, as if he were a stone wall in a flood. Ha-Eun, come here, Mi-kyung whispered, her voice cracking. Move away from him, baby. Please. The man's eyes flickered open. They were dark and sharp, like pieces of broken glass. Even while he was bleeding out, he looked like he could snap a person in two. He didn't move, but the air in the room grew heavy. He looked at Mi-kyung, then at the door, then back at her. He didn't say a word, but his silence felt like a warning. He saved me, Mommy, Ha-Eun said, her voice small and steady. The bad man in the hood, he was going to grab me. But the giant man fought him. He fell down to help me. Mi-kyung looked at the blood dripping onto her rug. She knew who this man was. Not his name, maybe, but his kind. You didn't live in this part of the city without learning to recognize the shadows that ran the streets. He was a wolf. But the man who had been following them for weeks, the one who left dead flowers on their doorstep and watched them from the park, that man was a demon. She had a choice to make. She could call the police, but the police had never stopped the stalker before. They had written reports and told her to lock her doors. If she kicked this giant out now, he would die on the sidewalk, and the hooded man would be waiting right there in the rain to finish what he started. Can you walk? Mi-kyung asked, her voice gaining a tiny bit of strength. Tae-Sung grunted, a low sound deep in his chest. He tried to push himself up, but his face twisted in pain, and he slumped back down. A fresh wave of red soaked into his shirt. The spare room, she said, pointing toward the tiny door past the kitchen. It's just a floor mat and some boxes. But the window has a metal bar. You stay there. I will help you, but you don't touch my daughter. Do you understand? Tae-Sung looked at her for a long time. He saw the terror in her eyes, but he also saw the fierce protection of a mother. He gave a single, slow nod. With Mi-kyung on one side and the wall on the other, the heavy man dragged himself across the floor. Every step was a struggle. He smelled of cold rain, expensive cologne, and iron. When they finally reached the small room, he collapsed onto the mat. The room was dark and smelled of laundry soap, a sharp contrast to the violence he carried with him. Mi-kyung hurried to the bathroom and grabbed her sewing kit and a bottle of strong alcohol. Her hands were still trembling as she returned. She knelt beside him, her breath coming in short gasps. As she cut away the ruined silk of his shirt, she gasped. His body was covered in old scars, reminders of a life lived in a world she couldn't imagine. But the new wound was the worst. It was a deep, jagged cut along his ribs that hissed with every breath he took. This is going to hurt, she muttered. Tae-Sung didn't flinch. He just watched her. He looked at the way she held the needle, her eyes focused despite her fear. He looked at Ha-Eun, who was standing in the doorway, clutching a stuffed rabbit, and watching them both. For a moment, the apartment was quiet. The monster was in the house, resting in the spare room. Mi-kyung felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She had brought a predator inside to keep the demon away. She didn't know if they would survive the night. But as she began to stitch the man's skin, she realized she wasn't just saving his life. She was gambling everything on the hope that even a monster could have a heart. Outside, the rain continued to wash the streets, and somewhere in the dark, the man in the hood was waiting. But for the first time in months, Mi-kyung didn't feel like a victim. She looked at the giant man on the floor. He was a stranger, a criminal, and a threat. But as his hand instinctively twitched toward the door whenever the wind howled too loud, she knew he was also a shield. The morning sun was weak and gray, peeking through the metal bars of the small bedroom window. Tae-Sung lay on the thin floor mat, his body feeling like it had been crushed by a truck. Every breath was a sharp reminder of the knife that had nearly ended him. He looked at the ceiling, watching a small spider crawl across the plaster. In his world, a man who showed weakness was a man who was already dead. He should have been angry at his situation, but instead, he felt a strange, quiet emptiness. The door creaked open just an inch. Tae-Sung didn't move his head, but his eyes darted toward the sound. He saw a small, pale face peeking through the gap. It was the girl, Ha-Eun. She was holding a bright yellow box in her hands, clutching it like it was a treasure chest. "Are you still broken?" she whispered. Tae-Sung didn't answer. He wasn't used to talking to children. Usually, people looked away when he walked into a room. They didn't ask questions, they just got out of the way. But this little girl didn't seem to know he was a monster. She stepped into the room, her scuffed light-up sneakers making a tiny clicking sound on the floor. She sat down cross-legged next to him. She didn't look at his scars with fear. Instead, she looked at them with curiosity, the way a person looks at a map of a place they've never been. She opened the yellow box. Inside were dozens of Band-Aids covered in bright, smiling cartoon cats and glittery stars. "Mommy fixed the big hole in your side," Ha-Eun said, pointing to the bandages wrapped around his chest. "But you have lots of little scratches on your hands. My teacher says even little scratches can hurt if you don't give them a hug." Tae-Sung looked at his hands. They were covered in small nicks from the glass and the gravel of the alleyway. He watched as she carefully peeled the paper off a Band-Aid with a pink cat on it. Her fingers were small and clumsy, but she was very serious about her work. She leaned over and pressed the sticky plastic onto a cut on his knuckle. "There," she said, patting it gently. "The cat will watch it for you." Tae-Sung felt a strange warmth creep into his chest. It wasn't the heat of a fever or the burn of a wound. It was something he hadn't felt since he was a boy, before the streets had turned his heart into a piece of cold flint. He looked at the pink cat on his hand. It looked ridiculous on a man who had spent his life fighting for power and blood. If his old associates saw him now, they would laugh before they killed him. "Why aren't you scared of me?" he asked. His voice was raspy and deep, sounding like two stones rubbing together. Ha-Eun looked up at him, her dark eyes honest and clear. "You have sad eyes, and you stayed in the rain so I could run away. A bad man wouldn't get wet for someone else." Tae-Sung closed his eyes. The simplicity of her logic hit him harder than any punch ever could. He had spent years convincing himself that the world was only made of predators and prey. He thought he was the wolf, but sitting here in this tiny room, he realized he had been nothing but a ghost. She continued her work, covering his scarred hands in a rainbow of cartoon characters. There were blue dogs, yellow ducks, and sparkling stars. By the time she was done, his hands looked like a child's coloring book. Tae-Sung didn't pull away. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel the need to reach for a weapon. Through the thin walls, he heard the sound of Mi-kyung in the kitchen. He heard the clink of a spoon against a bowl and the hiss of the stove. It was the sound of a normal life, a life he had never been allowed to have. He looked at Ha-Eun, who was now hummed a soft tune while she packed away her remaining Band-Aids. The ice around his heart didn't melt all at once, but a small crack had appeared. He was a Mafia boss, a man of violence and secrets, but in this moment, he was just a man with a pink cat on his finger. He knew the hooded man was still out there, and he knew his own past was hunting him, too. But as Ha-Eun smiled at her handiwork, Tae-Sung made a silent promise. The monster in the spare room wouldn't let anyone hurt the girl with the yellow box. The next afternoon, the apartment felt too quiet. The rain had stopped, but the air was still heavy and damp. Tae-Sung managed to sit up against the wall of the spare room. His side throbbed with every movement, but the fog in his mind was clearing. He looked down at his hands. The cartoon Band-Aids were still there, bright and silly against his tan skin. He should have ripped them off. But he didn't. Mi-kyung was in the living room, trying to make the space feel normal. She was folding laundry while Ha-Eun sat on the floor, drawing pictures of a big man and a little girl standing under an umbrella. For a few minutes, it almost felt like a real home. Then the front door rattled. It wasn't a knock. It was the sound of something sliding through the mail slot and hitting the floor with a soft thud. Mi-kyung froze. She looked at the door, her face turning as white as a sheet. She didn't move for a long time. Tae-Sung watched her from the shadows of his room. He saw the way her shoulders shook. Slowly, she walked to the door and picked up a small, brown paper package. There was no name on it, no return address. She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a small, white silk ribbon. It was beautiful and clean. But when Mi-kyung saw it, she dropped the box as if it were made of hot coals. She let out a small, choked sob and backed away, hitting the kitchen table. Tae-Sung ignored the stinging pain in his side and forced himself to stand. He limped into the living room, his shadow falling over the small package. He looked down and saw more than just the ribbon. There was a Polaroid photo face down on the rug. He leaned over, his breath coming in short gasps, and flipped it over. The photo was of the apartment door. But it wasn't taken from the outside. It was taken from the inside of the living room, looking toward the kitchen. It had been taken while they were all sleeping. Tae-Sung felt a cold rage boil in his blood. He had spent his life around dangerous men, but this was different. This wasn't about money or territory. This was about fear. He looked at the white ribbon. In some cultures, a white ribbon was for a funeral. It was a promise of death. He was here, Mi-kyung whispered, her eyes wide and glassy. He was inside. He stood right where you were standing while we slept. The locks. I locked them. I checked them 3 times. She ran to Ha-Eun and pulled the girl into her arms. Holding her so tight the child let out a small cry of surprise. Mi-kyung was looking at the windows, the vents, and the shadows in the corners. She looked like a bird trapped in a cage with a cat. Tae-Sung walked to the front door. He examined the lock. It was a cheap, standard bolt. To a man like Baek Do-hyo, it was as useless as a piece of wet paper. Tae-Sung knew how people like Baek worked. They didn't just want to kill. They wanted their victims to know they were never safe. They wanted the fear to eat the person alive before the final blow was dealt. Tae-Sung turned back to Mi-kyung. He saw the absolute terror in her face, and then he looked at Ha-Eun, who was staring at the white ribbon with a confused frown. The girl didn't understand the threat, but she knew her mother was scared. He didn't come to kill you last night, Tae-Sung said, his voice low and steady. It was the voice he used when he was giving orders to his soldiers. He came to show you he could. He wants you to run. He likes the chase. Where can we go? Mi-kyung cried. The police won't help. We have no money. We are nothing to him. Tae-Sung looked at the metal bars on the windows. They were thin and rusted. He looked at the door that had been so easily opened. He realized that this apartment, which Mi-kyung had worked so hard to keep, was now just a trap. The locks were useless. The walls were thin. He reached out his large, scarred hand and picked up the white ribbon. He crushed it in his fist. For years, Tae-Sung had been the one making people afraid. He knew every trick, every shadow, and every way to break a door. He was a monster, but he was their monster now. Don't run, Tae-Sung said, looking Mi-kyung in the eye. If you run, he wins. From now on, nobody enters this house without through me. He saw the doubt in her eyes, but he also saw a tiny flicker of hope. She looked at the cartoon band-aids on his knuckles, and then at the hard, cold look in his eyes. She nodded slowly. Tae-Sung spent the rest of the afternoon sitting in a chair by the door. He didn't sleep. He didn't move. He just watched the handle, his hand resting on a heavy metal pipe he had found in the spare room. He knew Baek Do-hyo was watching the building. He could almost feel the man's eyes on the walls. But Tae-Sung wasn't a victim. He was a predator who had found something worth guarding. As the sun went down and the shadows grew long, Tae-Sung realized the truth. A lock is just a piece of metal. A real wall is a man who has nothing left to lose. The night was long and silent, but Tae-Sung did not close his eyes. He sat in the wooden chair by the door, the metal pipe resting across his knees. He watched the shadows move on the wall as cars passed by outside. His mind was spinning. He kept thinking about the photo and the white ribbon. Something about the way the ribbon was folded felt familiar. It was too neat. It was too professional. When the sun finally began to rise, Mi-kyung came into the kitchen to make tea. She looked tired, her eyes red from lack of sleep. She didn't say anything, but she set a warm mug on the table near Tae-Sung. He nodded his thanks. He waited until Ha-Eun was busy playing with her blocks in the corner before he spoke. The man in the hood, Tae-Sung said, his voice a low rumble. Has he ever spoken to you? Mi-kyung shook her head. No. He just watches. He sends letters. He leaves things. It felt like he was obsessed with us. Like a crazy person. Tae-Sung looked at the white ribbon again. He picked it up and turned it over in his scarred fingers. This isn't just a crazy man. This is a message. He remembered a man he used to know years ago. A man named Baek Do-hyo. In the world of the syndicates, Baek was known as a cleaner. He was the person the rival gangs sent when they wanted to erase someone. Baek didn't just kill people. He broke them first. He was famous for leaving white ribbons at the homes of his targets. It was his signature. It meant the hunt had begun. A cold realization washed over Tae-Sung. This wasn't just a random stalker who happened to find a mother and daughter. This was a professional hitman from a rival syndicate. Tae-Sung's old enemies weren't just trying to kill him in an alleyway. They were using this monster to find him, or perhaps to punish him by hurting the only people who had shown him any kindness. He isn't following you because he's a lonely man, Tae-Sung said, his eyes darkening. He is a ghost from my world. He is a cleaner for the White Dragon gang. Mi-kyung dropped her spoon. It hit the floor with a loud clang. What? You mean? He's here because of you? Maybe at first, Tae-Sung admitted. But now it doesn't matter. To a man like Beck, once he starts a hunt, he doesn't stop. He doesn't care about the reason anymore. He only cares about the kill. The stakes had changed. This wasn't a personal obsession anymore. This was a mafia hit. The apartment wasn't just a hiding spot. It was a battlefield. If the White Dragons knew Tae-Sung was alive, they would send more men. But Beck was different. He worked alone. He was a predator who enjoyed the fear more than the finish. We have to leave, Mi-kyung whispered, her voice trembling. If he is a professional killer, we can't stay here. If you leave, he will catch you on the street, Tae-Sung said. He is out there right now, waiting for you to run. He wants you in the open where nobody can hear you scream. Tae-Sung felt the crack in his icy heart grow wider. He felt a heavy weight of guilt. These people were in danger because he had crawled into their lives. But he also felt a spark of the old fire. He wasn't just a dying man on a floor mat anymore. He was a soldier. He looked at his hands, still covered in the silly cartoon band-aids Ha-Eun had given him. The pink cat looked back at him. He realized that the old code of the Mafia, the code of selfishness and power, was gone. He had a new code now. He was the only thing standing between a professional monster and an innocent child. I know how he thinks, Tae-Sung said, standing up despite the burning pain in his side. I know how he moves. He thinks I am a broken dog, waiting to die. He doesn't know that a wounded wolf is the most dangerous thing in the woods. He walked over to the window and moved the curtain just a tiny bit. He scanned the street below. He didn't see anyone, but he knew Beck was there. The ghost was waiting for the right moment. Tae-Sung turned to Mi-kyung. Stay away from the windows. Keep the girl in the back room. I need to find a way to finish this before he brings the whole syndicate to your door. The silence in the room was heavy. The threat was no longer a shadow in the rain. It was a professional soldier from a world of blood. Tae-Sung knew that the locks on the door were useless against a man like Beck. He would have to be the lock. He would have to be the wall. The small apartment felt like a pressure cooker by the third day. They were low on milk and bread. And Ha-Eun was growing restless. Mi-kyung looked at the empty fridge, and then at Tae-Sung. He was standing better now, though his face was still tight with pain. He knew staying inside was safe, but hunger was a different kind of enemy. We have to go to the market, Mi-kyung said, her voice small. It is only 2 blocks away. It is broad daylight. There are hundreds of people there. He wouldn't try anything in a crowd, right? Tae-Sung didn't want to tell her the truth. To a man like Baek Do-hyo, a crowd was just a forest of shields. But they couldn't starve. He pulled on a dark hooded jacket to hide his bandages and his face. Stay close to me, he said. Don't look at the faces of the people passing by. Just look at the ground. The local market was a chaotic maze of shouting vendors, steaming vats of spicy rice cakes, and piles of bright red peppers. The air was thick with the smell of fried fish and car exhaust. To anyone else, it was just a busy Tuesday afternoon. To Tae-Sung, every person wearing a mask or a hat was a potential threat. Every motorcycle engine that revved too loud sounded like a gunshot. Ha-Eun held his large hand tightly. Her small palm was sweaty against his scarred knuckles. He walked with a limp, his eyes darting from rooftop to doorway, scanning for the ghost from his past. Get what you need, Tae-Sung whispered to Mi-kyung as they reached a vegetable stall. Fast. Mi-kyung grabbed a bag of onions and some rice, her hands shaking as she counted her coins. Suddenly, the crowd shifted. A group of teenagers ran past, laughing and pushing each other. In that split second of noise, Tae-Sung saw it. Across the aisle, near a stall selling heavy winter coats, a tall figure stood perfectly still. He wore a dark worker's jacket and a cap pulled low. He wasn't looking at the food. He was looking at Ha-Eun. In his right hand, a thin, silver wire glinted in the sun. Run, Tae-Sung hissed, grabbing Mi-kyung's arm. What? What is it? She gasped, but she didn't wait for an answer. She grabbed Ha-Eun and started to move toward the exit. The man in the cap didn't run. He glided through the crowd like a shark through water. People bumped into him, but he didn't stumble. He was closing the gap. Tae-Sung knew he couldn't use a gun or a knife here. If the police came and saw his tattoos, his life, and their safety, would be over. He had to be a ghost to fight a ghost. As they turned into a narrow alleyway that led back toward their street, the man accelerated. He stepped out from behind a stack of wooden crates, blocking their path. He pulled the wire tight between his hands. It was a garrote, a silent tool for a silent killer. Go! Behind the crates. Tae-Sung shouted, pushing Mi-kyung and the girl away. The attacker lunged. He was fast, moving with the cold precision of a machine. He swung the wire toward Tae-Sung's throat. Tae-Sung ducked, the movement tearing at the stitches in his side. A white-hot flash of pain blinded him for a second, but he didn't stop. He slammed his shoulder into the man's chest, using his sheer weight to drive him back against a brick wall. The killer didn't make a sound. He didn't grunt or curse. He just narrowed his eyes and tried to wrap the wire around Tae-Sung's wrists. Tae-Sung grabbed a heavy plastic crate filled with empty soda bottles and smashed it downward. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the alley. Out on the main street, someone shouted, "Hey, what's going on back there?" Tae-Sung knew he had seconds. He couldn't kill this man here, and he couldn't be caught. He grabbed the killer's throat with one hand and slammed his head against the brick. The man's cap fell off, revealing a face as cold and empty as a frozen lake. It was Beck. He looked at Tae-Sung and smiled, a thin, haunting line. "You're getting slow, Butcher," Beck whispered. Tae-Sung heard the whistle of a police officer in the distance. He gave one final, powerful shove, sending Beck stumbling into a pile of trash bags. Without looking back, Tae-Sung grabbed Mi-kyung and Ha-Eun, dragging them through a back door of a laundromat and out onto a different street. They ran until they reached the apartment building, their lungs burning. Once inside, Tae-Sung slammed the door and locked every bolt. He slid down the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Blood was starting to seep through his jacket again. Ha-Eun was crying now, hiding her face in her mother's skirt. Mi-kyung was staring at Tae-Sung, her eyes wide with a new kind of terror. She had seen him fight. She had seen the look in his eyes, the look of a man who knew exactly how to break a human being. "He followed us," she sobbed, "even in the sun, even with everyone watching." Tae-Sung looked at his hands. One of the cartoon band-aids had fallen off during the struggle. He felt the cold reality of his situation. Beck wasn't just a stalker anymore. He was a hunter who had found his mark. And the police weren't an option. If they came, they would take Tae-Sung away, and the girls would be left completely alone with the demon. "He won't try again today," Tae-Sung said, trying to steady his voice. "He knows I'm awake now." But as he looked at the terrified mother and child, he knew he couldn't stay. His presence was making them targets for the entire syndicate. He had to make a choice. Stay and fight as their shield, or leave and hope the ghosts followed him instead. That night, the burner phone Tae-Sung had hidden in his pocket finally buzzed. It was a cold, mechanical vibration that felt like a snake waking up in his hand. He stepped into the tiny bathroom and turned on the faucet, so the sound of running water would drown out his voice. "I thought you were dead," Tae-Sung, a deep, familiar voice said on the other end. It was Mr. Park, the senior advisor for the Jianpa syndicate. He was the man who had taught Tae-Sung how to be a predator. "I'm hard to kill," Tae-Sung rasped, his eyes fixed on his own tired reflection in the cracked mirror. "The White Dragons are making a mess of the city looking for you, Mr. Park said. And Baek Do-hyu is playing games in the shadows. The boss is unhappy. He says you have become a distraction, but he is willing to forget your mistakes. A car is waiting 3 blocks from your current location. Come back to us. We will fix your wounds, wipe your record, and deal with Beck ourselves." Tae-Sung felt a flicker of the old life calling to him. He could have his power back. He could have his money and his silk shirts. He could be the king of the alleyways again instead of a broken man sitting on a kitchen chair. "There's a catch," Tae-Sung said. "The catch is simple," Mr. Park replied. "You come alone. We heard you are staying with a woman and a child. The syndicate does not protect baggage. If you want to be a wolf again, you must leave the lambs behind. If Beck wants them, let him have them. They are nothing to us." Tae-Sung looked down at his hand. The pink cartoon cat band-aid was mostly peeled off, but the sticky residue was still there. He thought about the way Ha-Eun had hummed while she patched his cuts. He thought about Mi-kyung's shaking hands as she stitched his side. If he left now, they would be dead before the sun came up. Beck wouldn't just kill them, He would make it a masterpiece of pain to send a message to the world. "They aren't baggage," Tae-Sung said, his voice turning into a low growl. "Don't be a fool," Mr. Park warned. "You are a monster, Tae-Sung. You don't belong in a tiny apartment with a family. You belong in the dark. If you stay there, you die with them. Is a little girl's smile worth your life?" Tae-Sung looked through the bathroom door. He saw Ha-Eun fast asleep on the sofa, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin. He saw Mi-kyung sitting at the table, her head resting on her arms, finally exhausted enough to close her eyes for a few minutes. They were the only people who had ever looked at him and seen a human being instead of a weapon. "A wolf doesn't leave his pack," Tae-Sung said. "And right now, this is my pack." "Then you are a dead man," Mr. Park said, and the line went dead. Tae-Sung threw the burner phone into the toilet and watched it sink. He had just cut the only rope that could pull him back to safety. He was no longer a high-ranking boss. He was a man with no friends, no money, and a target on his back that was growing larger by the hour. He walked back into the living room and sat in his usual chair by the door. He felt lighter than he had in years. The old code of the syndicate was about taking what you wanted. The new code was about protecting what you loved. He knew the car 3 blocks away would eventually drive off. He knew his former brothers would now treat him like an enemy. But as he watched the steady rise and fall of Ha-Eun's chest as she slept, he knew he had made the right choice. He wasn't a boss anymore. He was a guardian. And if he had to go down fighting, he would make sure the demon had to go through him first. The smell of smoke didn't start with a roar. It started as a thin, bitter ribbon of gray drifting under the bedroom door. Tae-Sung was awake in an instant. His lungs burned before his eyes even opened. He didn't look for his shoes or his coat. He lunged for the sofa where Mi-kyung and Ha-Eun were huddled together in a restless sleep. "Get up. Now," he barked, his voice cutting through the silence. Mi-kyung bolted upright, coughing as the thick, black cloud began to fill the room. The orange glow was already dancing against the kitchen window. Beck hadn't used a wire or a knife this time. He had used a bottle of gasoline and a match. The cheap wooden door of the apartment was already screaming as the heat warped the frame. "The door is gone," Tae-Sung shouted over the crackle of the flames. "The fire is in the hallway." He grabbed a heavy blanket from the floor and soaked it with the last of the water from the tea kettle. He threw it over Ha-Eun, who was wide-eyed and paralyzed with fear. He didn't wait for her to move. He scooped her up in one arm, his side screaming in protest as the stitches pulled and tore. With his other hand, he grabbed Mi-kyung's wrist. "The window," he yelled. They scrambled toward the small window in the spare room. Tae-Sung used his heavy metal pipe to smash the glass and the rusted metal bars. He didn't care about the cuts on his arms. He kicked the frame out until there was a hole big enough for them to squeeze through. He lowered Mi-kyung out first, then passed the shaking girl down into her mother's arms. Tae-Sung tumbled out last, landing hard on the wet pavement of the narrow alleyway. He looked up. Their home, the only place that had felt safe, was a pillar of fire. The heat was so intense it singed his hair. "We have to move," Tae-Sung gasped, staggering to his feet. The night air was freezing, and the rain had turned into a cold, biting sleet. They were standing in their pajamas and thin jackets, shivering as the wind whipped through the dark alley. They had no money, no phones, and no place to go. "He's watching," Mi-kyung whispered, her teeth chattering. She looked at the shadows at the end of the alley. "He wanted us to come out." She was right. Tae-Sung could feel him. Beck was out there in the dark, enjoying the sight of his prey shivering in the cold. To Beck, the fire was just a way to flush the rabbits out of their hole. Now, they were in the open. Tae-Sung led them through a maze of backstreets, staying away from the main roads where the orange streetlights made it easy to see. His blood was warm against his cold skin, soaking through his shirt again. He felt dizzy, but he couldn't stop. Every time he heard a footstep or the splash of a car in a puddle, he shoved the mother and daughter behind a dumpster or a stack of crates. "I'm cold, Mr. Giant," Ha-Eun whimpered. Her light-up sneakers were soaked, and the little lights blinked weakly in the dark, like a tiny SOS signal. Tae-Sung took off his heavy jacket and wrapped it around her, leaving himself in nothing but his thin, bloody shirt. The cold felt like needles in his skin, but it kept him awake. They reached an old construction site near the river. It was a skeleton of concrete and steel, draped in flapping blue plastic sheets. It wasn't warm, but it was a place to hide. They huddled together in a corner, hidden behind a pile of dry cement bags. Tae-Sung stood at the edge of the shadows, watching the entrance. The city was a vast, glittering ocean of lights, but they were drowning in it. There was no one to call. There was no sanctuary left. The Butcher of Seoul was down to his last ounce of strength, and the demon was closing in. "He's coming," Tae-Sung said softly, more to himself than to them. He gripped the metal pipe until his knuckles turned white. He won't wait for morning. The hunt was almost over. They were trapped against the river, with the cold at their backs and a killer in the front. Tae-Sung looked at the pink cat band-aid, now hanging by a single sticky thread on his finger. He didn't feel like a boss or a criminal anymore. He just felt like a man who was ready to trade his life for a little more time for the girl. The stairs of the unfinished building felt like a mountain. Tae-Sung's breath came in ragged gasps, each one tasting like copper and cold rain. He pushed Mi-kyung and Ha-Eun toward the very top, out onto the flat, open roof. There was nowhere left to run. The city lights sparkled far below them, indifferent to the three shadows huddled against the wind. "Stay behind the water tank," Tae-Sung commanded. His voice was thin, but it held the weight of a final order. He turned back toward the metal door, his fingers trembling as he gripped the heavy pipe. The door didn't fly open. It didn't creak. It simply drifted back. And Baek Do-hyo stepped onto the roof. He had discarded his heavy jacket. In his hand, the silver wire was gone, replaced by a long, narrow knife that caught the blue glow of the distant neon signs. He looked at Tae-Sung's bloody shirt and the way his legs shook. "Look at you," Baek said, his voice smooth and cold. "The great butcher, hiding behind a woman and a child. You've traded your throne for a grave in the mud." Tae-Sung didn't waste his breath on words. He lunged. The collision was violent and messy. Tae-Sung swung the metal pipe with everything he had left, but Baek moved like a shadow. He slipped under the strike and drove his shoulder into Tae-Sung's wounded side. Tae-Sung let out a choked cry, his vision blooming with white light as his stitches finally gave way completely. He hit the wet concrete hard, but he rolled, swinging the pipe out to keep Baek at a distance. Baek circled him, his eyes dancing with a sick kind of joy. He wasn't in a hurry. He slashed the air, the tip of his knife grazing Tae-Sung's shoulder. "You're fighting for nothing," Baek hissed. "Once you're dead, I'll take my time with them. I'll make sure they remember your face while they scream." A roar started deep in Tae-Sung's chest, a sound that wasn't human. It was the sound of a monster protecting its own. He ignored the fire in his ribs and the numbness in his arms. He stood up, tall and terrifying, even as his blood pooled at his feet. He threw the pipe. It wasn't meant to hit. It was a distraction. As Baek ducked the flying metal, Tae-Sung charged. He tackled the killer, his large hands finding Baek's throat. They crashed into a pile of scaffolding, the metal pipes clattering like thunder. They fought like animals. Baek stabbed wildly, the blade sinking into Tae-Sung's thigh. Then his arm. Tae-Sung didn't let go. He used his head as a hammer, smashing it into Baek's face again and again. He felt Baek's nose break. Felt the man's grip on the knife weaken. They rolled toward the edge of the roof, where there was no railing, only a long, straight drop into the dark. Baek scrambled to find his footing, his eyes wide with the realization that Tae-Sung wasn't trying to win anymore. He was trying to end it, no matter the cost. "Stop," Baek wheezed, his face a mask of red. "You'll kill us both." Tae-Sung grabbed Baek's collar, his eyes locking onto the killer's. For a split second, the world was silent. The rain stopped. The wind died down. "I died in that alleyway days ago," Tae-Sung whispered, his voice as hard as the concrete beneath them. "Everything since then has been a gift." With one final, massive heave, Tae-Sung threw himself forward, driving his weight into Baek's chest. They tipped over the edge together. Baek screamed, a high-pitched, thin sound that was cut short by the wind. Tae-Sung felt the air rushing past him. He felt the weight of the world lift. But as he fell, his hand caught a dangling thick electrical cable that hung from the side of the building. His arm nearly snapped in its socket as he jerked to a halt, swinging violently against the concrete wall. Below him, there was only the sound of a heavy thud in the darkness. Tae-Sung hung there, his fingers slipping, his heart drumming against his ribs. He looked up. High above, at the very edge of the roof, a small face appeared. Ha-Eun was looking down, her eyes wide, her little hand reaching out into the empty air. "Mr. Giant," she cried. Tae-Sung took a deep, painful breath. He wasn't ready to let go yet. He began to climb, his bloody hands finding the rough edges of the stone, moving upward toward the only light he had ever truly known. 6 months later. The city of Seoul had forgotten the fire in the industrial district. To the world, Jang Tae-Sung was a ghost. His name had been wiped from the syndicate's books. And the police had closed the file on the butcher after finding no trace of him at the construction site. In the world of shadows, being dead was the only way to truly be free. The morning air was crisp and smelled of toasted bread and car exhaust. Tae-Sung stood in the deep shade of a narrow alleyway across from a bright, modern elementary school. He wore a plain black jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He moved with a slight limp, a permanent gift from the night he fell, but he was strong again. His wounds had healed into thick, silver scars that he kept hidden under long sleeves. He checked his watch. 8:15 a.m. Right on time. A small figure in a bright yellow school uniform rounded the corner. Ha-Eun was skipping, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. She looked taller than she had in the rain. Her hair was pulled back in neat braids, and she was laughing at something her mother was saying. Mi-kyung walked beside her, looking relaxed and healthy. They had a new apartment now, in a neighborhood where the streetlights actually worked and the police cruised by every hour. Tae-Sung watched them from the darkness. He didn't wave. He didn't call out. If he stepped into the light, he would bring the shadow of his past with him. And he had promised himself he would never let that shadow touch them again. He was a secret they didn't even know they had. As Ha-Eun reached the school gates, she stopped and looked around. For a heartbeat, her eyes drifted toward the alleyway where Tae-Sung stood. He froze, holding his breath. She tilted her head, as if she felt a familiar presence, a warmth in the air that didn't belong to the sun. Then, she reached into the side pocket of her bag and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. Even from across the street, Tae-Sung knew what it was. It was a bright yellow Band-Aid with a smiling cartoon cat on it. She pressed it against the cold metal of the school gate for good luck, gave it a little pat, and then ran inside to join her friends. Tae-Sung felt a strange, tight pull in his chest. It wasn't pain. It was peace. He stayed in the shadows until the school bell rang and the courtyard was empty. He scanned the surrounding streets one last time. He looked at the men in suits, the delivery drivers, and the strangers loitering on the corners. His eyes were no longer those of a predator looking for a kill. They were the eyes of a watchman. He knew that there would always be monsters in the world. There would always be men like Beck and syndicates like the White Dragons. But they would have to get past him first. He was the monster that the other monsters feared. He was the wall that never slept. Tae-Sung turned and melted back into the crowd of the busy city. He had no throne, no money, and no name. But as he walked away, he looked at his own hand. On the inside of his wrist, hidden under his watch, he had kept one thing from his old life, a tiny, fading sticker of a glittery star that Ha-Eun had given him. He was the silent guardian. As long as he was breathing, the little girl in the yellow uniform would never have to run again.